Wow! It's week 5 in this non-weekly course of Psychology 101 seminars. So this is going to be week 5. We're going to be talking about consciousness this week. This is a fun lecture. I don't have all like the cool illusions and stuff this week, unfortunately, but I am going to talk a lot about drugs. So if you're cool with that, there we go. Also sleep, which is more practical, but we're gonna do a lot of stuff here. It should be pretty fun. I generally enjoy this, but also I enjoy everything about this. I just like teaching. It's fun. Okay, so let's get into consciousness. So before we get into this one, let's start off with a little thing. Let's do the preview. We're going to talk about the biological functions of sleep. We're going to talk about dreams, and we're going to talk about dream interpretation. And I'm going to have very strong opinions about dream interpretation because, well, I have strong opinions about dream interpretation. We're going to talk about alterations of consciousness and altered states of consciousness. So this is the part where we talk about whether sissy hypno videos are real. And it's going to be where we talk about drugs. So we're hitting all the bases here. We're talking about dream interpretation, we're talking hypnosis, and we're talking drugs. It's going to be a fun one. So let's get started. What's more fun than alien abductions? So based on the figures I've pulled up, about 10% of college students say they have met an alien. Now, when you consider that there are about 21 million students enrolled in college courses around the world, it translates to about 2 million-ish alien encounters in the last 20 years. That's a lot. That's a lot. It's more episodes of that's more encounters than there are episodes of the X-Files, and that's also a lot. But why might that be? Why might that be? I think that if you want to understand the prevalence of alien abductions, it helps to look somewhere else. It helps to look to maybe sleep paralysis. So sleep paralysis is a interesting phenomenon that we'll talk about a little bit more later on and some theories beyond it. But in general, people that experience sleep paralysis experience waking up, quote unquote waking up, because typically they're still dreaming. It's like, but finding themselves unable to move. And while they're in this sort of between state of sleeping and wakefulness, they start to experience hallucinations. Like you may have heard of the term the sleep paralysis demon. Well, generally, people that do experience sleep paralysis, in addition to these hallucinations, maybe things are moving around in the room, maybe they hear sounds, maybe they feel or believe they are feeling vibrations in the room. They might also experience, very commonly, difficulty breathing, which comes to this idea of this famous and like very time-honored tradition of the troll sitting on a person's chest. So what it kind of comes down to here is that the hallucinations and the altered states of consciousness that go along with sleep paralysis might help explain some of those alien encounters, particularly ones that start with someone saying, I was asleep in my room, and then I woke up and I could not move, and there were people in the room with me, and then they took me into their spaceship, and all of these things happened. It has a lot in common with the sleep paralysis demon stories, and probably helps to understand them a little bit as well. But in general, thankfully, sleep paralysis demons are known to be friendly and, well, maybe not friendly, but generally harmless. So, in addition, many abductees are reporting a history of sleep paralysis, suggesting a tight connection between these phenomenons. All right, let's get into it though. So this is kind of an interesting thing, right? It's like we think about alien abductions, we think about the connection between that and sleep paralysis, which suggests like these weird hybrid states between where we have a connection between our sleepful states, our wakeful states, our ability to move, and all kinds of wild stuff. And we've talked about sort of the biology of the brain a lot so far. But we're going to pivot a little bit. We're going to talk about more subjective experience now. We're going to talk about consciousness and how we make sense of the world and how there are some weird ways and weird quirks that might impact the way that we experience it. Let's get into it. Like I said, when we want to talk about subjectiveness, or we want to talk about consciousness, we're really looking at our subjective experiences of both the world around us and also ourselves. We have the gift and curse of self-awareness, and that we are able to introspect into our thoughts, our emotions, our sensations, decisions, actions, and so on, and so on, and so on. But consciousness isn't one kind of mode. You don't throw into drive and just go. We have different states of consciousness, in fact. We generally are awake. Hopefully, you are awake. If you're sleeping in the back of the class, again, I don't take attendance. Just go home and nap. I'd rather you do it there. But we also have our wakeful states, we have our sleep states, and when we look at stuff like sleep paralysis, it would suggest that there is also room for in betweens. But this is not really a hard distinction. I think this is why these conversations about consciousness are really fun for me, because it really illustrates how the world of psychology, whether it's biological or when we're getting into more subjective experiences here, is not one where there are typically hard and fast boundaries between things. It's not like you are asleep or awake. There tends to be different degrees of wakefulness and sleep, areas where they might overlap that we're going to talk about later. So, what does the biology of sleep look like? Some of you might be familiar with the term circadian rhythms. I guarantee you that you have them, even if you haven't heard that term before. And what these are cyclical processes that basically regulate a lot of our biological functions to roughly a 24-hour cycle. Things like the shifts in our body temperature, maybe you start feeling warm when you start feeling tired. And or if you're maybe sick, like when I get a cold or sick or have allergies or anything like that, I notice that I really start to become more symptomatic as I get closer to my typical bedtime because my body is starting to wind down. There are changes in hormonal levels within my body and so on and so forth. Now, what's interesting here is that our circadian rhythms are a little bit malleable, and we'll talk about that. But generally, disruptions are going to be harmful. You can bend them, but they do start to break under some more extreme circumstances. If you've ever traveled across multiple time zones and been jet lagged, where maybe in your circadian rhythm cycle, you should be going to sleep, but wherever you just showed up, it's in the middle of the day, so you stay awake for an extra 10, 12 hours, you shift your sleep cycle, or maybe if you are shifting between a frequently working on maybe a third shift or a graveyard shift, and then also intermittently working morning shifts. And so you're not getting a consistent cycle or consistent schedule to your sleep habits. That can lead to some harmful disruptions in how your body starts to process time. And how do we know all this? Well, we need to talk a little bit about caves and space, because that's where some of the most important work on circadian rhythms has come from. So, whoa, and there we go. Here we go. So I want to talk to you for a second about Michael Ciffer. I probably mispronounced his name, and if I did, I'm sorry. Anyway, so one of his biggest achievements in his career, so in addition to founding basically the field of cave study, also known as, homicidal sleepwalking is coming later. I told you it's a fun one. So what he ultimately did, and when he was working, he was younger in the 1960s, he decided that he wanted to make some kind of contribution to the space race. And so in that his imagination, he thought, what are some challenges that astronauts might face when they get up into space where we don't have typical day-night cycles? Well, he did the most sensible thing that he could, which is he sequestered himself for 2 months in the abyss of Sargon without time cues. So he sequestered himself for 2 months in a glacier, in a space where there were not regular, there were no regular time cues. There wasn't a regular day-night cycle. And then worked with other speleologists who are also cave scientists to organize similar experiences. Eventually, he even went on 6-month-plus stays in situations where, once again, you're in a cave, you don't have a typical day-night cycle. And what he found, and other speleologists found, was that in the absence of the typical day-night cycle, their circadian rhythms went bonkers, and they started to shift to a 48 rather than a 24-hour cycle. Now, it's interesting, though, and it's critically important for space exploration because these findings and what they noticed were reported by astronauts later on when they eventually got to space. And they started experiencing, under these circumstances, when their circadian rhythms were increasingly shifted and bent, they started to break, causing other impairments, like they started having short term memory loss, maybe their appetites were disrupted, and so on and so forth. So, our ability to make sense out of time and keep our circadian rhythms regular has really important downstream effects on stuff, again, like growth, our growth, appetites. Let's see, even memory formation, which we'll talk about in a later chapter. All right, back to lecturing. Whoa. Back to slides. There we go. Yep, here's a picture of him. Quality guy. Just love to be in caves. So if you've heard the term biological clock, that's basically what we're kind of talking about here. It's linked to our circadian rhythms, and we actually have a neurological mechanism located in the hypothalamus that regulates our sleep and wake cycles. Now, if you've ever taken over-the-counter melatonin, you've probably found that it makes you very drowsy. Well, the thing is that melatonin is a naturally occurring hormone that is produced by the pineal gland while you are awake. And it is a synthesis of serotonin. So in your brain, when you are awake, your brain is converting serotonin, the neurotransmitter we talked about in the past, like 2 weeks ago, 1 week ago. I've also lost track of time. But while you're awake, your pineal gland is hard at work doing a whole bunch of stuff, one of which is converting serotonin into melatonin. And as melatonin accumulates while you're awake, that's ultimately the biological mechanism that underpins fatigue. And so the neural networks that are underpinning our sleep-wake cycles have a hormonal basis as well. You're awake, your brain is producing melatonin. The amount of melatonin that you have in your brain is influencing your ability to stay awake. As you get more, you get tired. And then when we sleep, the brain flushes out that melatonin and then it starts up again when you wake up. Now, the interesting thing about this, though, is that because we are so tied to our circadian rhythms, it's not so much that we have an internal clock, and that there are a lot of ways that we can fudge things. Remember, we're talking about when you're in a cave, you don't have light, and so on. Things start to happen, and your brain starts to accommodate because there are typically milestones that we hit in the day that help the brain recognize sort of what time it is and where you should be on a scale of wakefulness. So stuff like exposure to sunlight, or when you eat. Eating at roughly the same time every day is also part of how your brain keeps track of things with this biological clock. And it's one of the reasons that it's probably a good idea to turn off screens an hour or two before you start going to bed. As we sit here and look at monitors, the light causes certain effects in the brain that are pretty similar to exposure to sunlight. You remember when we talked about the eye last time? We talked about how exposure to light causes the pupil to contract and everything. When those things happen, it doesn't just influence how we see things by controlling the amount of light and exposure on the retina, it also influences our sleep-wake cycles, because it turns out that most of the things in your body are connected in some great and terrible ways. So like I said, generally, light hits our retina, it goes to the occipital lobe, where it transmits information to the brain and the general neural network undergirding our sleep-wake cycles, sending hormonal triggers throughout the body that are going to be associated with wakefulness. When the sun goes down, then we start to get into a different set of triggers and biological mechanisms that are eventually going to increase fatigue and lead us to fall asleep. All right. So here's the real question that I'm sure all of you are wondering. How much sleep do we actually need? Well, it's a complicated question. It's a very complicated question. Actually, my first job out of grad school was as a principal investigator in a sleep lab, which is not where I thought I would end up. I'm a social psychologist, so going to work in a clinical psychology lab about working on sleep wasn't my first choice for a job. But it was an interesting experience because I was always taught a lot of the same stuff, that we generally need about 6 to 8 hours, something like that. but it might not necessarily be that. Now, there is a general decrease as we age, and newborns tend to need about 16 hours, and then seniors, like people over the age of 65, tend to need about 7 to 8. But one of the interesting things is that when you want to break out and say who are the people that get the least sleep, a lot of times it's people like doctors and lawyers, people that are generally considered to be highly successful. And so if we're trying to think about need for sleep with the outcome of productivity or successfulness or degree of functioning, very highly functioning people are sometimes the people that have schedules that allow them to sleep the least. And this was where my boss, the head investigator in the lab, really rocked my world and made me question a lot of what I knew about sleep. So it's a weird and fuzzy question, but generally, if you're looking in a psych textbook, they're going to say 6 to 8 hours because for the vast majority of people, that's going to be roughly enough to stay healthy. Now, what's interesting though is that there are people that do have an extreme minority of people that have a mutation on the DEC2, which allows them to actually get away with less than 6 hours of sleep while staying fully rested. It is wild. So there are people out there who are able to sleep for 4 or 5 hours a night, and they're totally fine. Their functioning is totally normal. They can be completely high achievers and all that. It's basically a superpower, if you ask me. The Michael Phelps of not sleeping. And in general, if you get off track, if you have one bad night of sleep, it's not a huge deal. Like, I mean, whomst amongst us doesn't have nights where you stay up late so you can watch the Dota International or something like that? And generally, it's not going to wreck you if it's a one-off kind of thing. Now, the problem is when you start building up a sleep debt. So here's the thing. Like I remember said, let's say you generally sleep 8 hours a night. One night you just have a really rough time, and let's say you sleep for 4 hours. You now have 4 hours of sleep debt. And that one night, not that big of a deal. But let's say you pull an all-nighter later that week and you don't get 8 hours at all. Now you've got 12 hours of sleep debt, and so on and so on, and it builds up over time. As people accumulate sleep debt, it throws off our circadian rhythms, including stuff like in different hormonal triggers and stuff in the body, which can lead to weight gain, depression, even a decreased immune system. So when people tend to miss a lot of sleep, they're actually more likely to get sick. And remember how we talked about how when circadian rhythms are disrupted with astronauts in space? Remember how they said that they have a disruption in their short-term memory? And also reaction times and problem solving, a lot of those higher level brain functions start to slow down as you accumulate sleep debt. And can you just catch up on one good night? Nah. I'm sorry, you can't. It's like at most, even if you go and you just like clonk out for 14 hours, you're gonna make some progress on that sleep debt, but there's a diminishing return after that point where basically if you keep sleeping beyond that, so if you sleep for even like 16, 18 hours, it's not gonna do much more than sleeping for 14. And so it takes several days of consistently good sleep habits to be able to work out the accumulated sleep debt. So yeah, just like a one-off, it's fine. 2 bad nights, you're okay. 3 to 4, you might be feeling it. I know that's bad news for everyone. Whenever I teach this lecture, I always have students ask me, okay, but like, I'm built different. Or, so what can I do to just like wipe out my sleep debt? And it's like, what if I take a bunch of melatonin? And I tell them like, that's not gonna help. You just need to have, the best way to not have sleep debt is to just get good sleep in the first place. Because it's kind of a pain in the butt to try to catch up on it. All right, so stages of sleep. You've probably heard a lot about these in the past, but I'm going to correct a couple misconceptions. In general, we have 5 stages of sleep that we go through. And throughout the course of a night, we go through a range of cycles and then repeat that cycle over and over again while we're sleeping. So in stages 1 to 4, we call these non-REM or NREM stages of sleep. typically because there's no rapid eye movement and people tend to have fewer or any dreams. And when they do dream in stages 1 to 4, those dreams tend to be very different than the dreams that occur in stage 5 or REM sleep, which is characterized by those rapid eye movements. So, how do we get into this? All right. So stage 1 is funny because it's frequently the stage where people do not actually recognize that they are asleep. It is characterized what we call theta waves that might be a little bit hard to see on the blackboard, but they're kind of these big old spindles here because you can generally tell what stage of sleep someone is in by characteristic patterns in the EEG reading. Remember, the electroencephalogram is generally how people study sleep. We talked about that with brain imaging. So when people are in stage 1, it only takes about 5 to 10 minutes of that 90-minute cycle. In this stage, people are barely asleep. Generally, they might not even realize they are asleep. Now, if you've ever been kind of nodding off or daydreaming for a bit, and then maybe you're woken up by your arm jerking or your leg jerking, we call those myoclonic jerks. They're weird kind of twitches of the muscles that can happen as a person is falling into a sleepful state. Hypnagogic imagery, or sort of, I guess not so much hallucinations, but maybe weird things that people are hearing, maybe you mishear something or you hear something that isn't there, are also characteristic here. After about 5 to 10 minutes, you move into stage 2, which lasts for about 10 to 30 minutes. So stage 2, we got a question here. Yep, so exactly. So myoclonic jerks and hypnagogic, if you've ever had the feeling where you're sitting and suddenly you feel like you're falling, that is a characteristic part of stage 1 sleep. So have you ever just been like in a classroom and then you feel like maybe you're getting a little bit sleepy, and then whoa, you're falling? That's stage 1. And sometimes you'll start yourself awake because brains are bad at things sometimes. Yeah. Or yeah, that's another good point, that it's like you're falling asleep and then you hear like a loud bang or something like that, and then nothing was there. These are what it means that you were in stage 1 sleep and then some neurons triggered in your brain that caused you to have that experience. Kind of weird, right? So stage 2 is where people start to fall deeper into sleep, and we spend about 65% of our total sleep in stage 2. It's the big orange one here that's marked with the D. I'm going to actually turn on my cursor for a second here. It's this one over here. And it's characterized by these K complexes, which are these tightly bound spindles, or these are sleep spindles, and then K complexes are these huge sweeping lines over here. Moving on to stage 3 and 4, we have characteristic patterns of delta waves, which are these, again, big sweeping waves. And now stages 3 and 4 are also, like, I'm going to say everything's interesting because I think this stuff is cool. I mean, I worked in a sleep lab after all. Stages 3 and 4 are pretty much the most important when it comes to actually feeling rested. This is what we consider to be deep sleep. If someone is clonked out and noises are not waking that up, moving is not waking them up, then they're probably somewhere in the 15 to 30 minute portion of deep sleep, or stages 3 and 4. Now, what's interesting is that as we age, we tend to spend less time in deep sleep. And also, this is the stage of sleep that is most impacted by alcohol. So if you end up, you take, maybe have a nightcap, or you could take a drink or two before you go to sleep, and you wake up, maybe even after sleeping for your normal 8 hours, but you don't feel rested, it's because alcohol has a specific effect on these deep stages of sleep, causing you to spend less time there, so you wake up feeling less rested. And now, what you've all been waiting for, rapid eye movement sleep, is about a 10 to 20 minute portion of the cycle where we have a pattern of brain behavior. It's not showing up super well on the blackboard. Sorry about that one. But what's interesting is that at the top here, it's being chroma keyed out. Oh no! Let me fix that. Turning off the chroma key, now it's a little bit brighter. We can see that the wakefulness has a very characteristic pattern of really tight psychological activity. So does REM. It's actually very similar to wakefulness. And we end up spending more and more time in REM sleep as the night goes on, which is the exact opposite of what happens when we look at deep sleep, where every time we go through this cycle, we end up spending less and less time in non-REM sleep and more time in REM sleep. So this is basically what it looks like. As you fall asleep, you drift into stage 1, to stage 2, to stage 3, to stage 4, and then you come back up. So you go down to 4, and then you come back up in a loop, and then go into REM. Then you go 1, 2, 3, 4, 3, 2, 1, REM. 1, 2, 3, 4, 3, 2, 1, REM. And that's going to repeat throughout the course of a night with longer REM cycles and shorter non-REM cycles in between. So, on the subject of dreams, lots of stuff has been written about dreams, but it's interesting because once again, it's not hard and fast. I kind of grew up being told that we only dream in REM sleep, but that's not necessarily true. It's like we actually have evidence looking again at these patterns acquired by electroencephalograms that we have dreams in non-REM sleep. They tend to be short, they tend to be very thought-like, more repetitive and procedural. But like if you start having sort of some odd dreams where like you're folding laundry, those are going to be more characteristic of non-REM dreams relative to REM dreams that tend to be more bizarre, outlandish, and strange. But the thing is, REM dreams are, for whatever reason, biologically crucial. We don't really understand why, but if you don't dream, if you don't enter REM sleep, there are some very scary consequences. So in REM, generally what we start to see is that we are paralyzed. Now remember when we talked about the sleep paralysis demon? Yep, that's a good question. So the non-REM dreams are the ones that where you feel like you just wake up, go about your day, and that was it, and it was all a dream. Yep, so those would be more characteristic of non-REM dreams. All right, but getting back to REM, so remember the sleep paralysis demon and how people reported sort of vivid imagery, feeling like they were stuck, they couldn't move, they felt a pressure on their chest, and so on. One of the things or guiding theories around sleep paralysis is that it has some connection with REM sleep. So what our brain does while we're dreaming and having these big vivid dreams, that typically part of the medulla or the brainstem shuts off. And so our bodies are paralyzed and we can't move. However, we do still have this, abundance of neural activity going on. So if a person were to have maybe some wires crossed, they might find themselves in a position where they are awake, but their bodies are still paralyzed. Maybe they woke up during a cycle of REM sleep, and now they're in a weird kind of in-between state. They can't move. They're maybe sort of dubiously, maybe in an early stage of sleep, and it is goofy, and I can imagine very terrifying. And if we aren't paralyzed, we end up developing REM behavior disorder, which is basically sleepwalking. And like I was saying, REM is essential to functioning. So what's interesting here is that because, again, psychologists just like to fuck up everything all the time, there have been a number of experiments where people thought, well, we know how sleep works. We know that there's this 1, 2, 3, 4, 3, 2, 1 REM cycle. And we know that we can use electroencephalograms to chart the trajectory of sleep. What if we just took rats and just woke them up with loud noises every time before they went into REM sleep? In a number of weeks, they just fucking die. Isn't that cool? It's not. But it is, it's fascinating, right? Like we have dreams. They're strange, they're weird, they're fun, they're illogical and phenomenal. But then they also have this deep connection to our biological functioning, so much that if we don't have them, if we don't go into REM sleep, we die. And our bodies know this, so that if you are deprived of REM sleep, your body will actually compensate. Remember this, this chart? Basically, if you're deprived of REM sleep, your body will quickly shoot through the 1, 2, 3, 4, 3, 2, 1 cycle to get to REM as quickly as possible and stay in there longer. There's a lot of really interesting stuff going on there. Why do we have rapid eye movements, though, while we're doing it? No one knows. It's an unknown. What the eye movements do, I don't know. And like, why is it that our eyes aren't paralyzed, but the rest of our bodies are? I don't know. I just work here. So lucid dreaming, everyone loves lucid dreaming. It's always a fun topic. If you've ever seen the popular movie Inception, that was really popular when I wrote these slides, and I took all the references out because it's no longer topical. Well, there's a lot of discussion about lucid dreaming. And just like how when we look at the electroencephalogram, being asleep in REM sleep looks like being awake, lucid dreaming suggests that maybe there isn't a hard dichotomy between being asleep or awake, and that there is sort of a state of consciousness between the two with features of waking and sleeping. It's not a well understood phenomenon. It's it's exhausted in pop psych. You can find any number of books promising to teach someone how to lucid dream. They're a waste of your time. Just throwing that out there. Like most pop psych, it's a waste of your time. It's bullshit. But lucid dreaming is not. It is a thing people do, and in some cases, people can figure out how to do it, but as far as finding a consistent method, it'll remain elusive. So sleep disorders are widespread and costly, and this can mean anything. This can mean disrupted REM sleep, this can mean sleep death, this can mean sleepwalking. There's a whole number of ways that things can go wrong in our sleep-wake cycle, and they tend to be pretty costly. In fact, about $35 billion a year in productivity and revenue is lost as a result of sleep disorders. And basically, almost the majority of people, between 30 to 50% of the population, are going to experience sleep disorders or some form of consistent sleep disruption at some portion of their lives. The most common of these is insomnia, which about 10 to 15% of people report experiencing at some point in their lives. However, it's an interesting phenomenon. It's highly comorbid with stuff like depression, pain, certain medications, which might cause disruptions in sleep-wake cycles. And it's but generally when it comes down to insomnia, it's usually spoken of as a difficulty going to sleep. At least that's how I typically have encountered this in popular media and popular psychology. But it's a much more comprehensive term. It can also deal with the difficulty in going to sleep or staying asleep or waking up too early. It's basically referring to a broad point of a difficulty either getting to or staying asleep long enough to get the full sleep-wake cycles that we need. Question: does it mean that it would be better for capitalism if we were allowed to sleep more? I don't know. There's only how much research saying that a 4-day work week is better for productivity and that people should have more time off. All right. Practical advice. Practical advice. If you want to have good sleep hygiene, which is to say that you're able to get to sleep faster or stay asleep longer or be more rested, there are a couple things you should do. One, don't look at your clock, sleep in a cool room, and importantly, stay on a regular schedule. This is hard. This is really hard. Because generally, if you're checking your phone, if you're on social media, if you're watching it and all this, we spend so much of our time looking at screens, and the problem here really is that you're looking at your dang old phone. Another point here in terms of things you shouldn't do or you should avoid doing: try to avoid drinking caffeine within about a 4-hour window of trying to go to sleep. This one's contentious. Some people would say don't take naps, but I'm a napaholic personally, and I think I have pretty good sleep hygiene, so I'm going to put a caveat on that one. Doing stuff like reading in bed is frequently suggested as a way of calming down and going to sleep, but I'm going to actually put that in the don't category. One part of sleep hygiene is to make it so that your bed is a spot you go to sleep. And doing stuff like reading in bed, scrolling your phone in bed, using your laptop in bed, watching TV in bed, it's gonna start to make an association in your brain between those activities, such as paying attention and being awake, and not and being in your bed. You want to have your bed to be associated mostly with calming down and going to sleep. Also, like we are talking about with light and circadian rhythms, TV use and computer use before bed are generally going to make it so it's a little bit harder to fall asleep. Another don't, not that anybody, I don't think many people are super strict about this one. The point is, you could say don't drink alcohol as well. I'll just put it out there. It's like, or at least you try to avoid it. Now, like an interesting caveat on the caffeine point as well is that there really there's a diminishing return with caffeine as well. No matter how much caffeine you drink, it leaves your body within 4 hours. Even if you drink a whole ass can of Monster, that caffeine is out of your body in 4 hours. Also, there's a kind of a diminishing return, and by diminishing return, I mean if you take more than about 200 milligrams, it doesn't affect you at that point. It's like time after time looking at caffeine studies and dosages. Caffeine doses that are higher than 400, like higher than 200 milligrams, generally don't make any difference relative to a dose of 200 milligrams. And also, that amount is going to leave your body within 4 hours. Yeah. So, like Brent's question here. So, if you read right before bed, it does give you a consistent pattern, and it does give a way to calm down. It's true. But so getting the pattern and all that, a sleep psychologist, which I am not, would tell you that that's all very good, but you can do that somewhere that isn't your bed. And the association between your bed as a spot that you go to sleep is important. But so is having that kind of schedule. So maybe even having a sleeping chair or something like that that you can go to, even if it's in your bedroom, just keeping the bed for sleeping is important for maintaining good sleep hygiene. All right, more sleep disorders. Narcolepsy. Basically a rapid onset of sleep. There's a sudden experience of cataplexy. Remember when we talked about where a person is unable to move their muscles? Again, narcolepsy also is going to make a connection between like sleep paralysis and sleep disorders and REM sleep as well. Narcolepsy is basically a do not pass go, do not collect $200, report directly to REM sleep. People that are narcoleptic in response to sudden surprise or elation can slip immediately into REM sleep, meaning that they just go right into that deep phase of sleep, their bodies lock up. And so for people who are narcoleptic, you might even they might experience something like they go to a haunted house, we're coming up on Halloween, they get scared and then immediately fall into deep sleep. Goofy, right? Sleep apnea is also a commonly experienced sleep disorder. I guess actually I want to take it back. Not goofy, interesting, right? That like we are able to kind of just jump. There are some people that can just go right into REM sleep in response to exhilaration. Now, when it comes to sleep apnea, this is again pretty common. It's like it deals with, generally snoring. It's like for people that do snore, sleep apnea is a risk. It's a blockage of the airway while a person is sleeping, which causes people to wake up because generally a blockage of the airway kicks in a lot of the brain's defense mechanisms, causing the person to wake up. People that have sleep apnea might wake up hundreds of times a night, but never realize it. They wake up, they move, they fall immediately back asleep. It becomes a very rote process, but it does disrupt the sleep cycle enough that they don't really get to and stay in those deep cycles of sleep that are so important for restfulness. Night terrors are frequently brought up. They're typically experienced by kids, not so much by adults. Generally these are going to happen in stages 3 and 4 for kids, where they wake up and maybe start screaming, sweating, they are confused. It's like as if something terrible is happening. Again, generally pretty harmless in children, and they usually don't remember these dreams, which is characteristic of non-REM dreams or non-rapid eye movement dreams. Sleepwalking, however, affects about 15 to 30% of children and 33 to 5% of adults. Where this might actually be, remember when we talked about narcolepsy a minute ago as a point where there's like a rapid onset of REM sleep that causes their bodies to become paralyzed and limp, characteristic of being in REM sleep? Well, what if that didn't happen? And that's generally what's going to happen with sleepwalking. And this is actually common enough that it has been used as a murder defense. Let's bop over to that other point here. Bump bump-a-dum, bump-a-dum. Homicidal sleepwalking. It's so common and has been used for so long, going back to 1846. This has its own Wikipedia like about 69 cases. I guess I'd say nice, but it's not. And it's like up to the year 2005, about 69 cases have been reported of someone using sleepwalking as an excuse for a homicidal action where they killed another person. It's pretty wild. And if you want to break into this on the Wikipedia page and get into this on your own, it's very interesting. The cases themselves are actually quite fascinating, and this has been used a couple of times in movies. It boggles the mind, really, this idea that a person could act out a dream that causes them to cause harm to another person. And back to lecture. Boom. I'm gonna get better at this over time. All right. All right. I'm gonna take a quick sippy. If you've had any weird pauses here, it's because I'm taking sips of water. I've been moving and on the phone with people and stuff like all week, so my voice is pretty shot. So why do we dream? Why do we dream? There's a lot of interesting theories that go along with this. It could be about categorizing information. It could be that when we sit down and lay down, go to sleep, that our brains are trying to process events, maybe trying to make simulations of threatening situations and ways that we could potentially deal with them. It's pretty contentious. Why do we dream? We know that there's a biological need for it, because if we don't dream, if we don't get the REM sleep that we need, we literally die. So there are a couple of competing theories about why we dream. Ugh. Gotta talk about Freud. I hate this. All right, Freud. Let's get this over with. Freud conjectures that we have a conscious brain, the ego, and when we are asleep, the ego is less able to control the sexual and aggressive impulses of the id. And so dreams are sort of a defense mechanism, like the Minotaur in the labyrinth. Our brain concocts these elaborate scenarios to prevent these violent and sexual impulses from the id from bubbling up and disturbing our rest. But it's too much. We can't possibly fathom the horrors of how horny our ids are. And so they have to be transformed and sublimated into symbols and stuff that have to do with wish fulfillment. And so there's a concept that runs through psychoanalytics of manifest and latent content, in dreams. So the manifest content is the cigar, but the latent content, it might be that it's not necessarily a cigar, if you know what I mean. This is basically what contrives most of psychoanalytic dream interpretation. Not a huge fan of it myself. I'm always gonna put that out there. Yeah. I don't like this at all. And there's a lot of holes in the theory, mostly that some people don't remember their dreams and have fine sleep. And most of our dreams are negative to begin with. So if our brains are trying to construct these elaborate labyrinths to keep our horny id from being able to influence our conscious mind, why are they all so terrible? And why are many of them straightforward? Like we were talking earlier, like you might have a dream where you just get up and go about your day, and then you realize that that was a dream. Why does that matter? And it doesn't explain nightmares at all. Basically, there's no evidence at all for this. I hate this, but I have to always talk about it when I talk about sleep, and I hate this. All right, moving on. This is better. So, activation synthesis theory is a little bit more scientific. And it comes to the idea that there basically is no reason that we dream. Our brains are firing off random signals in REM sleep. We know that the brain is highly active during REM sleep, which means that neurons are going, maybe memories are being triggered, and the brain's attempt to interpret this activity is what makes dreams. Basically, the brain in our conscious mind, or sleeping conscious mind, is trying to make sense of all the random activity and firing neurons that are happening. So activation is synthesized into what we know as dreams. It explains how dreams can be far removed from daily life, But if this is all based on random activity, it doesn't make sense that our dreams are consistent and usually, as Brent just brought up in chat, rooted somewhere in time. Like, we dream about things that have recently happened to us. If our activity was totally random, why do we dream about the things that happened to us earlier that day? Well, we get to neurocognitive theories, which is that dreams do in fact have meaning. And it's about trying to process memories and thoughts that have happened throughout the day. The book that I used to teach when I was lecturing on this class was pretty vague about this because it's kind of thrown out there. But basically, it helps explain how adults have more complex dreams and how we have consistency in our dreams over time, especially at points where we have they're points of routine. You dream about going to your job. You dream about the people that you interact with often because our brains are trying to file away and process memories. And so that's why we get these consistent points and consistent themes and dreams while we have consistent elements of our daily lives. All right, take a sippy. We're out of dreams. So I'm going to open the field here for questions. Anybody got any questions about dreams? Dreams. Let's see. Y'all had fun with Freud. I had way more fun with Freud than so that's an interesting point that we're going to talk about more so when we get to memory. So the thing is, like, let's just say I tend to, of the three schools here, tend to fall into the neurocognitive theory. So why do we not remember our dreams, or why do we only remember our dreams so often? My theory and some neurocognitive theories are going to say that it depends on when you are waking up, because we have to focus on, incorporate, and try to shift stuff from our working memory to our long-term memory. One point here is that whatever dreams we are having don't really have the opportunity to be ruminated on enough to end up in our long-term memory. So you might wake up and you might have a short recollection of it because it's in your waking memory, because maybe you woke up in the near proximity of REM sleep. But if you don't focus on that and think about that dream, those memories are going to quickly fade. So even if you don't remember your dreams, you are still having them. It just might be that when you wake up, you're too far away from REM sleep to have been able to ruminate on or be aware of the fact that you were dreaming to begin with. So it has a lot to do with when you wake up, and it also the amount of time that you spend on focusing on them. So yeah, like as Aaron brought up, it's like you wake up, you got shit to do, so you don't really think about it, and they just kind of fall out of the brain like most of the other stuff that comes into our working memory or short-term memories, but we don't have the opportunity to focus on enough to commit to our long-term memory. So yeah, if you want to remember dreams, dream journals, I've been told, really help. Where you wake up and maybe you have a notes app or something on your phone, you're like, shit, I had a dream about this, and you can record that over time. All right. Altered states of consciousness. Basically, these are going to deal first with, let's talk about hallucinations. Perceptual differences or in the absence of a stimuli, like a loud noise, the feeling of falling, would fall under the experience of a hallucination. Importantly, they're not just visual, like I just described. They can be auditory. They can deal with the sense of touch or even our sense of equilibrium, like we just said, the sense of falling. And about 10 to 35% of people report experiencing hallucinations, maybe connected with stage 1 sleep. And further, outside of those, when we start getting into being able to have stimulus in the or sensation in the absence of stimulus, we also start getting into reports of out-of-body experiences, which tend to fall in line with people that tend to also experience stuff like sleep paralysis. And it's like in the sense that they have a feeling that they are detached from their body. They might report being able to waking up and floating above their body and being able to look down. Is there empirical evidence? No. And oftentimes, what's interesting about these out of body experiences, so someone who might claim to have an out of body experience or the ability to do something like astral project, for example, they can project their consciousness outside of their body. Well, one way you would empirically test this is that you go and you say, all right, well, if you can project your consciousness outside of your body, there are a couple of items on a table in the room next to us. Project your consciousness to the room next to us that is separated by a wall and tell us what those items are. And in these kinds of controlled situations, the people that claim to be able to experience and have these out of body experiences or astral project don't identify those items at a greater than chance level. So there's not a lot of evidence for this. And some of this, again, might be coming from scrambled sensory information when you're coming out of or a sleep state or going into an early sleep state. Remember, stage 1 sleep, we tend to have hallucinations, maybe strange sensations. These might be interpreted by people as they're falling asleep as an out of body experience. Close cousin to these is the near death experience. Being visited by spiritual beings, seeing loved ones, the light in the tunnel, are frequently reported even across cultures. I should stop reading chat while I'm lecturing, but thank you for that. we all know. Like, look, you're fine, you're fine, you're fine. It makes it fun for me too. I like having banter with people. It's part of my teaching style. Yeah, I swear, there's a soul player in the next room. They're already mashing. But that doesn't eliminate anything. We all know they're all mashing all the time. So near-death experiences, like trying to meet a soul player, it's like, or like, might consist of lights and tunnels, spiritual beings, and so on and so forth. And they do differ culturally because the way people perceive an afterlife tends to be bounded to their experiences and culture. And these have actually been experimentally triggered. So whereas the other points where we're talking about, especially like out of body experiences, are not necessarily supported by experimental evidence, near death experiences actually are. And that when the temporal lobes and maybe even the use of drugs or hallucinogenics, etc., it's like cause altered states of consciousness, people report having similar experiences to what comes up in a near-death experience. And part of this might be because there are a lot of really strange chemical and physiological changes that happen in the brain as a person approaches death. And some of those same chemical and physical changes, like neural activity, can be induced in a laboratory environment, causing people to experience near-death experiences that are pretty similar to what people who are actually dying report. Wild, right? The light at the end of the tunnel, the culturally bounded sense of death and what that looks like, that can be made in a lab. Also, déjà vu. This is the initial D section of the lecture. We talked about déjà vu. This came up in a question, actually, I think during the last point when we talked, like the last lecture, we talked about why do people experience déjà vu. So déjà vu is broadly understood as the experience of feeling like you've been in the same place before. You've experienced the same moment before, and now you feel like it's happening again. This is pretty common. Most people experience déjà vu at least once in their life. And now, the reason that people feel like déjà vu tends to happen is a miscommunication in the brain. So we have areas of the brain and neural networks that are responsible for recognition. And now what happens in these cases is that what we experience as déjà vu is basically maybe the neurons miscommunicating and the same memory gets filed away twice. So when that second copy gets saved, if I'm going to use a Windows metaphor, the operating system of our brain says, do you want to replace this memory? There's already an identical file here. That miscommunication means that we file the same point twice, and then that pop-up asking if you want to replace the existing file is the experience of déjà vu, where we feel like, oh shit, this happened to me before, even though maybe it didn't. Or maybe a similar thing happens that is, yeah, Jamisfu, like as Brent brought up, where we recognize something that is very similar to something that happens. But it's not the exact event, but it triggers some of the same circuitry that is responsible for recognizing things that have happened to us, creating a weird feeling where you're not quite sure if you've been in that place before. Yep. So one of the theories is that so at the time we experience the event, that miscommunication happens, and so the memory is basically created twice, leading to the experience that this thing is happening, but it's also happened to me before. I've been here before, I've had this conversation before, maybe not. But in as far as your subjective perception of history and time, your brain recognizes that this happened before. This is, I swear this happened. Now hypnosis, the lot of interesting YouTube videos built up around hypnosis. I'm gonna debunk a couple of these here. Hypnosis broadly refers to a set of techniques that might alter a person's perception, and now about 15 to 20% of people are able to be hypnotized. We would categorize them as being highly suggestible. And in some cases, through these sets of techniques, those people can be convinced to adjust their thoughts, feelings, or in some cases, even behaviors. Now, it's largely pseudoscientific. And you think about stuff like the Manchurian Candidate, etc. Hmm. It's embellishing the idea of hypnosis. There is some support in clinical scenarios, but it's almost never conclusive. And it's really not the way you think about it, where a person can be programmed to do or act out certain techniques. Generally, when people are hypnotized, they don't really fall into a trance state in which they can do amazing things. It doesn't turn people into mindless robots. Instead, they generally are going to be suggestible, but maybe a little bit more likely to do things that they probably would have already done. And so it's very difficult, if not impossible, to hypnotize a person to do something they weren't going to do anyway. And there really, interestingly enough, is not a lot of biological difference between wakefulness and hypnosis, meaning that when people are hypnotized and people put them through an fMRI or an EEG, it's not like it's a unique phenomenon or a unique gear of the brain that people can be shifted into by watching a watch swing back and forth or listening to a specific frequency or something like that. It is not like sleep. And generally, the people that are hypnotized are fully aware of what they're doing and what their surroundings are like. They just become more suggestible. And generally, tend to not forget what happens. The idea that you go into this trance state where you don't remember anything that happened afterwards is not supported at all. And it's maybe a slightly shifted sense of consciousness that some people can be put into, where they become highly suggestible in so far as they would do things that they would do anyway. But you can't hypnotize a person to do something they didn't want to do in the first place. So I got news for you if you get into those sissy hypno videos. Now, this is the less fun part of this. There is a popular myth that actually has ruined many people's lives that people under hypnosis are going to experience super memory. They're going to be able to pull up past lives and all kinds of stuff. Not true. It improves recall. People tend to recall more information overall. But that information is typically not accurate. But importantly here, the people that are hypnotized in order to recall information about an event or a crime or something like that also tend to be more confident in what they are reporting. So they are coming up with a bunch of information that is not real, but they are very confident it is. And this explains, if you're very familiar with a lot of the satanic panic and the belief that people were experiencing satanic rituals or had become aware of satanic abuse by members of their communities. A lot of this evidence was pulled out through hypnosis. People's lives, careers were ruined by this. People had to move towns, change their names because they were so destroyed by this. And in some cases, it's still used. But of all the things where we have clinical evidence here about hypnosis, this is the biggest one here. Basically, people become phenomenal and very confident bullshit artists when they're hypnotized. And now it's time to talk about drugs. Drugs. Both legal and illegal drugs can alter consciousness, and if you remember when we talked about psychoactive drugs, many of the drugs we're going to talk about today work in the same way. They're going to influence the amount of neurotransmitters or degree of neural activity, and by doing so, change the way that we perceive either our bodies or ourselves or the world around us. Substantial abuse and repetitive abuse of drugs can result in substance abuse disorders, alcoholism, dependence, etc., and by creating a cycle of tolerance and withdrawal. So the thing is, our brains tend to want to stay at a balanced level of our general neurotransmitters. So if you end up taking a brain like cocaine that acts by increasing the amount of dopamine in the synaptic cleft, what ends up happening is that your brain starts releasing less dopamine to compensate. So you need more of the drug to get the same effect. Now, what happens when you stop taking the drug? Yeah, withdrawal. Where a person, let's say in the same example, where you end up taking a bunch of cocaine, you get into abuse of cocaine, where your brain starts to produce less dopamine as a consequence because you're taking a drug that increases the amount of dopamine in the brain. When you stop taking the drug, your brain doesn't catch up right away, and you go through withdrawal where now you have chronically low dopamine, which has a whole host of negative effects on the body. This is the same bit with alcohol. Alcohol is a depressant. It ends up suppressing a lot of activity in the brain, so that when alcoholics come off and they stop drinking, their brain has been sort of training with weights. And so now when those weights are off, they have a phenomenal upsurge of neural activity, causing them to experience pain, loud noises, a prickly feeling in their skin, so on and so forth, because they've been taking a depressant and now they're going through withdrawal. And this is where we start getting into stuff like physical dependence, where drugs sometimes can be used to avoid withdrawal symptoms. So if you've ever heard of stuff like methadone, in the case of opiates, in some cases, the withdrawal symptoms can be life-threatening, in which case a secondary drug might be used to wean a person off. And interestingly enough, when it comes down to it, this was a distressing statistic when I first came across it. About 6% of students in colleges across the country are physically dependent on alcohol. Let's see, what's my take on people saying things like social media and games are bringing our dopamine tolerance too high and that people should take a dopamine detox? I don't know enough about whether or not reward structures like achievements and stuff actually increase our dopamine levels is chronically enough to really create dependence in the way that something like cocaine abuse would. So I'm hesitant to say that that's going to, well, it increases it hits with the same spot in our reward centers, which are implicated with dopamine. I would say that it's probably not that simple. There's a lot of other social expectations and all that. It's interesting because dopamine has really been clicked into in the past couple of years as this like the social media neurotransmitter. It's not. It does a lot more than that. So I don't know if social media is enough to cause someone to experience, the significantly elevated levels of dopamine that are go along with something like cocaine abuse. I think that in that case, what we're saying is like a dopamine detox is a more comprehensive bit, like unplugging. And if you want to hear about dopamine detoxes and disconnecting and social media, I have a lecture series up on my YouTube channel about the book How to Do Nothing. It's really cool. You should check it out. That's a plug. I did a plug. All right. Let's explain drug church. Why do people do drugs? Well, there's the obvious short-term euphoria, but there's also sociocultural influences. In other words, people can be pressured to do drugs or even to abuse drugs. And when we talk about there being something called an addictive personality type, it doesn't exist. In a clinical sense, there is no such thing as having an addictive personality, but there are some personality traits that might influence drug use and susceptibility to maybe the peer pressure that might lead to drug abuse. There's also the reinforcing self medication cycle that can underlie abuse. Let's say that you are nervous about going to a party, and so you pregame, you drink, so you show up drunk. And you get there and people like you and think you're funny. And so you think, wow, the alcohol must have helped. I wasn't as stressed out. I was more relaxed. And then I did a great job at the party. And now my social media following is just taken off and I'm going to be the most popular VTuber of all time. Yeah, well, what do you do next time then when you're going to a party? Drink again. There's a self-reinforcing cycle here where people start to think that I'm funny at the party when I'm drunk. And so they start thinking that they need to be drunk to be funny, and it creates a self-reinforcing cycle. There's also genetic influences. We do know that certain genes are connected to being more susceptible, particularly to alcoholism. That has been very well documented. All right. Specific info. Depressants and alcohol. Like we were talking about before, how do depressants and alcohol work? They work by depressing the activity of the central nervous system versus stimulants, which operate by increasing it. Alcohol is the most widely abused drug in the US, responsible for more deaths than marijuana, more instances of domestic violence than marijuana, it's a messy one. When you start to think about, and when you actually start to look at alcohol and the prevalence of abuse and the consequences of abuse, you start to wonder why alcohol is legal, I'm not gonna lie. Especially more legal than other drugs, especially like marijuana and so on and so forth. But that's an editorial point from me. At low doses, alcohol can actually operate as a stimulant because it first, interestingly enough, works by suppressing higher level brain function and then works backwards. And so in low doses, where maybe you take a shot, it might start to work out a person's inhibitions and causing them to maybe be more active, feel more outgoing, and so on and so forth. At higher level doses, though, it starts to work backwards in evolutionary order. So it starts at the forebrain and then is going to gradually work back. When you start getting to a point where you've consumed enough alcohol that your sense of balance has been disrupted, that you maybe are starting to have blurry vision, that is a concerning point because it means that you are anesthetizing the portions of your brain that are more responsible for basic biological functions. And if you drink enough, you start anesthetizing the brainstem and parts of your brain that are required to just do general function, like your heart beating or breathing. The effects of alcohol are going to vary a lot. It depends basically by sex and weight. And the reason that it varies by sex is because of the amount of water that people carry in their bodies and relative fat distributions and percentages. Interestingly enough, when we're talking about sex here, for example, if you're trans femme, like myself, I'm a trans woman, I shoot myself full of BAP juice once a week. I, over time, actually became far less tolerant of alcohol while undergoing hormone replacement therapy as a consequence of the shifts in the amount of water that my body holds and the amount of fat that my body holds. So it's not so much as like a biological XY chromosome thing, it has a lot to do with hormonal levels in the body, more so than that. Now, what's interesting is about expectation, because our personal and societal expectations play a big role in how we process and react to alcohol. So here's a balanced placebo design. This is such a funny experiment. I fucking love this one. So let's just say you take people and you put them in one of four conditions. You tell them that they are going to have to deal with people later on in maybe a socially anxious scenario. You give them, in one condition, 2 drinks, both the drug, the actual beer and the placebo, which is maybe a non-alcoholic beer. And you tell them it's 2 beers. Now, in these other conditions here, you might give them just the placebo or give them just the alcohol, and in some cases you give them nothing. And you look at the relative effect. And now what's fun here, I didn't have it, is that, I thought I had a follow-up slide there. What's fun is that if you have people where you tell them that they're about to drink a beer, they start to act drunk. It's a common prank that people will play on people at parties that haven't had a drink before. You'll give them a non-alcoholic beer, and then they start to act drunk, not because there's any effect of the alcohol, there's no alcohol in there. It's entirely their expectation of what it would be like to be drunk that's on display. It's a fun little prank to play on people. Don't do that. It's very cruel. But this is also an example of applied research design and how you can use psychological research and research methods to play pranks on people. Because that's really what psychologists are. We're professional pranksters. All right, let's talk about sedatives. Benzodiazepines are widely used, are highly addictive. They are frequently prescribed for anxiety or insomnia. Stuff like Lunesta and prescription sleep medications are going to fall as sedatives or hypnotics. They work by slowing down the amount of activity in the brain, but they are highly addictive, highly habit-forming, and frequently you have to get these prescribed by a doctor if you're going to use them at all. And this is why when you look at stuff like prescription sleep aids, like Lunesta, or it's the one that always comes to my brain, mostly because there was a picture from a Lunesta ad earlier in these slides, you're going to find out, or also like Xanax is also up there as well, Xanax and all that, are going to be prescribed, usually not for long-term use. And the reason is because these tend to be highly habit-forming and tend to be very, very, very easy to abuse. Stimulants are, in contrast to depressants, they rev up the central nervous system. They tend to increase a person's heart rate, their respiration, their blood pressure. Nicotine is the most used stimulant. It is highly addictive, and it leads to people having a sensation of alertness, but also relaxation. The alertness comes from that increase of heart rate, of activity in the brain that comes from the stimulant. Now, cocaine is also going to fall here. And now, cocaine is very interesting. It leads to a strong sense of euphoria and confidence that is followed by a big crash later on. Now, how does cocaine operate? Cocaine operates by binding to dopamine transporters in the synaptic cleft, meaning that when your brain sends dopamine into the synaptic cleft and it's binding to the receptors on an adjacent neuron, cocaine is going to block the reuptake of that dopamine, so that just keeps stimulating the dopamine receptors on that other neuron, in effect increasing the amount of dopamine that is in the brain in total. How habit-forming is dopamine? If you give monkeys in a lab free access to cocaine, they will literally dose themselves to death. They will dose themselves to the exclusion of anything else. They will not eat, they will not drink, they will not sleep. They will keep dosing themselves with cocaine until they literally die. How about that? Amphetamines, like methamphetamine, is also going to fall into the category of stimulants. Now, what's interesting about this is that amphetamines and stimulants tend to also be prescribed for the use of ADHD and different attention deficits. Now, the thing is that there is a chemical difference between methamphetamine and amphetamines. They are very closely related chemically, but are used for different purposes. Amphetamines tend to, in most people, are going to lead to an intense exhilaration and long euphoria, but also that euphoria and sense of exhilaration is going to cause damage to the tissue and blood vessels of the body, because the body is not actually designed to operate at that level. Interestingly enough, people that have ADHD or attention deficit disorder, or ADD, respond to amphetamines differently and actually can have improved functioning and ability to process information, while taking them. So Adderall, for example, is a stimulant. It's like people that don't have it, like, will tend, like, there's always, if you're going to a college course, you can usually find people that are selling Adderall because some people take it as a stimulant, but maybe some people that actually have undiagnosed ADD or ADHD take Adderall because they find it easier to study. So if you think you actually have attention issues, it's worth talking to a doctor about. But the susceptibility for abuse and dependence means that these tend, like amphetamines, like Adderall, tend to be very difficult. There's since we're talking about the category of stimulants, so there are a number. Like, I've read a couple of anecdotal stories that are kind of funny, where people realize they have ADD or ADHD by taking cocaine. So they did coke, and all they did was become very efficient, and they were able to focus on shit and just like do the dishes and stuff. And in those cases, those people probably went or should have gotten screened for ADD or ADHD. All right, narcotics. Let's talk about opiates. This is a general term. It generally was going to cover most opiates, morphine, heroin, codeine, etc. At least in the U.S., are going to fall under this banner. What's the way narcotics are defined are going to vary from country to country. But generally, what they do is they tend to relieve pain, induce sleep, and a sense of euphoria. Now, what's interesting here about codeine, codeine is typically put into cough syrup, which tends to be less common now because of its how prevalent it is for abuse. Codeine is actually broken down in your liver into morphine. And so when you think about lean, and people are like, "Oh yeah, drinking lean, it makes me feel really relaxed. It makes me, I don't feel pain, etc." It's because the codeine and the cough syrup in lean is actually breaking down in the body into morphine and having the same effect. When these opiates tend to be abused, the withdrawal symptoms can be lethal. I mean, I talked about heroin in particular before, where people that end up being addicted to heroin might experience life-threatening symptoms if they end up going through a cold turkey withdrawal, which is why in some detox facilities they'll actually be put on methadone or another drug to be able to gradually shift them off of their opiate dependence without going through these same, like, these actually potentially lethal withdrawal symptoms that go along with it. Psychedelics, the next category we're going to talk about, sometimes they're called hallucinogenic drugs. They induce dramatic changes in perception and mood and thought. Probably the most common of these, or at least like sensationalized of these, is LSD, which produces a intense alteration of perception. And in the case of people who maybe you've heard the term of a bad trip before, the exposure to LSD can cause people to experience panic and paranoia, depression, and confusion. Now, there is some emerging evidence, though, that in extreme cases of treatment-resistant depression, LSD and other psychedelics like MDMA can actually work to treat these extreme cases of otherwise treatment-resistant depression and cause improvement in people who have otherwise not been able to operate normally with a typical treatment regime or regimen. Regimen is the word. So MK Ultra was a discontinued government program where the CIA got very interested in the prospect of mind control, where with a combination of hypnotic techniques and drugs like LSD, they tried to understand if they could win the Cold War by trying to turn people into sleeper agents. It's a very LSD has a fascinating history. It pops up in the wildest places. Ecstasy, or MDMA, also falls under this banner. It tends to increase confidence and empathy. It's typically considered a party drug, and associated with dance culture, rave culture, etc. Much like it kind of operates as sort of a stimulant as well, where it can increase blood pressure, nausea, exacerbate depression. It can do all kinds of stuff. It depends on the person, really. Some people will be receptive to MDMA therapy. It's a very kind of cutting edge thing. For some people, it might worsen their symptoms, and so it's a interesting frontier in terms of how we can use psychedelic drugs to induce different shifts in consciousness to maybe even treat things like, again, using amphetamine to treat attention deficit disorder, using LSD or ecstasy to treat depression. MDMA is typically going to operate by increasing the amount of serotonin in the brain, kind of like in the same way that cocaine is associated with dopamine. Marijuana, this is gonna be my last slide here. Marijuana. Depends really where you want to put this. Typically, this is brought up as a mild hallucinogenic. It is the most frequently used illegal drug in the United States. I want to say a recent statistic that I saw put about 50% of people in the US, at least in that survey sample, have tried marijuana. Depending on the strain and what people smoke and the amount of terpenes and THC and all that, it can induce a wide range of effects, including the feeling that time has slowed down, a decrease in short-term memory, a sense of being giggly, of being hungry, and so on and so forth. But when it comes to comparing it to other illegal substances like MDMA, heroin, codeine, morphine, or at least regulated substances like codeine and morphine, there really aren't that many side effects, even when compared to alcohol. In fact, actually, the biggest risk is smoking, and it's like that it increases your risk of lung disease. So, marijuana has actually been legalized in many states in the United States, and it seems to be an increasingly popular push for a federal legalization. And that's the end of my slides for this week. So I hope this was fun. I'm going to transition over to office hours, and I'm going to crack open a little bit of a beverage here. So we're going to talk for a little bit about this kind of stuff, answer some questions and all that, but I hope this was useful. I hope it was fun. And hopefully I'll see you for the next chapter. I think we're getting into, let me go a spoiler here. Whoa. Let's see. Don't need to see that, but let me what is the next chapter? Chapter 6 is ba-ba-da-bum-bum-bum. Learning. We're going to learn about learning next time. So stick around for it. This one's going to be a lot of fun. This is the one where we get to talk about dogs. We get to talk about dogs. It'll be a lot of fun. So look forward to that. All right. For the time being though, thanks for hanging out. I had a lot of fun. And let's move over to office hours.